Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Data Resilience SpectrumCast. As you can see, Ms. Tricia is not with us today. She has a prior engagement, but we are joined by a SpectrumCast alum, Fraser MacIntosh, who is not only a expert at data resilience, but also our chief competitive person helping us kind of understand the differences that go on in the marketplace and just has a wealth of knowledge around what's going on. Welcome to the show today, Fraser. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it balances up the 4 images. Otherwise, you don't need 2 more. You know?
It does.
We're all about symmetry. It's very important.
Job there. All right. So today, what we wanted to talk a little bit about is we've been talking a lot all year and maybe even for the last 2 years about the resilience against especially ransomware. As we all know, Randy does his spin on the wheel of misfortune, and we usually talk about, someone who got hacked. But today, what we want to do is, and Fraser had a good conversation with us and brought up the fact that, when it's time to actually go pay that ransom, what do you do? And, over the course of this year, there have been a number of companies, probably too many to talk about, but you think of CNA paying $40 million in ransom, you think of JBS paying $11 million in ransom, Travelex paying $2.3 million in ransom. They get up there, right? One interesting thing that happened is that Irie Health Services had a demand to pay $20 million in ransom, and they refused to pay. However, the flip side is they believe it cost them almost $600 million in business damages, which begs the question, right? Do you just pay it and move on? Or, do you believe that your environment is safe enough to recover from? And so with that, Fraser, let's just pose the initial question. Do you pay the ransom or not?
No. Okay. Right. Well, that's that. Okay. Shall we end the podcast?
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye. Well, clearly it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, it's really easy to sit here with my hopefully not being encrypted as I'm talking to you system and wax lyrical about how, you're sending money to all the wrong sorts of people and you send the wrong message out. There's a reason that so many governments around the world say, we do not negotiate with kidnappers. It's the same thing. You fund them, you build their business models by paying the ransom. That said,
it sets a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, it funds them to do more next time, and maybe they can do 2 next time, 4, 8, 16, 32. You fund these things by paying them, and you make it work at larger scale. I think it is very easy, though, when you are not in that position of my company is about to fail, my kids' pictures are 20 years of pictures. All JPEGs and they're gone now. How do I get these back? And the temptation is overwhelming.
So we've seen a vendor or two in the market space that have actually put together some ransomware guarantees. What does the group think about these kinds of things?
I think it sounds good on paper, but at least the ones that I've seen, if you actually run the numbers, the probability that will in any way significantly inhibit, number one, the risk of an attack in the first place, and number two, your ability to recover from it is pretty nominal. I mean, that's my opinion, but
always read the small print. If it sounds too good to be true, it's going to be too good to be true. If you're having to buy the largest appliances or the biggest amount of software that the vendor can supply in order to be able to claim their ransomware guarantee, whatever it might be, have a think about whether that would mean that your company is worth more than the money that you could get back. And then consider how long it would take to prove that you can't get it back. Because, a few days of not operating will finish most companies these days.
Yep.
Well, I mean, to me, what I think with regard to any of those guarantees or insurance is the fact that you don't want to use it, right? The best course of action is not being put in that position in the first place, right? I don't want to have to be looking at those T's and C's to get that information. And I think any data protection strategy that's implemented properly and that you invest in properly can afford that same sort of protection in and of itself, right? You don't necessarily need that extra piece of paper to get there.
Yeah, I would be inclined to think, and I'm kind of inherently cynical, but I would be inclined to think that if I'm making a decision on my data protection infrastructure, my data resilience infrastructure based on a guarantee against ransomware, I'm probably not doing a very deep and rigorous analysis of the requirements and the fit of that solution. So, I mean, again, it sounds good on paper, looks good on banner ads, but it doesn't seem to carry a lot of weight, I wouldn't think. To me, I think to Sean's point, invest that money or think about, Fraser, you said this basically, and we've been saying this in every episode, think about how to architect and you're never going to 100% inoculate yourself from the threat or the opportunity of something happening, but do the best you can and invest wisely in making your environment as hardened and resilient as possible so that you don't end up a target in the first place. It's kind of preventive medicine, I guess.
What about the argument? And Sean, you mentioned this, and I want to get into another point you talked about insurance in a moment. But you mentioned, right, the T's and C's to be able to do this. We've seen compression guarantees from companies. We've seen deduplication guarantees from companies. Now we're seeing ransom, as you mentioned, Fraser. Ransomware guarantees. What do we think about the difference between, the IRE Health Services, right? Their example of, hey, give us 20 million, know it, but it costs them 600 million, vis-a-vis, hey, maybe I don't spend 20 million, but I spend a little more, right, to protect myself against this. I mean, I think we all know, right, in order to kind of put any of these solutions in place, right, it's going to take a lot from the different vendors, right? In order to, it's not just as simple as buying a box or buying their solution, right? I'm sure this comes with a lot of caveats, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to consider whether your solution is going to be extensible. So you might not be able to buy everything from day one. You might be, I mean, let's take D-RAID as an example. So a distributed erasure coded system which can protect against multiple failures much, much faster. With IBM's products, you can stick those distributed RAID systems in after the fact. And we've been running on legacy parity RAID now for what, 20 years, maybe 30. You're not going to be able to plan your system to start with. Getting back to the ransomware, I realize that might have been a bit of a tangent there. So you might be able to back up onto tape at the moment, take the tapes out, put them on a shelf. Don't leave them in the library. Libraries are not offline. And then when the next feature comes along, you might be able to move from that to, say, some sort of object storage, which is stored outside of the premises, and that is able to have a expiry date or worm type functionality added to it. So you need to be able to add these things as they go. We've got a really good track record of doing this at the moment. And then you come to on-prem immutable. And again, read and have a think about what this really means. So IBM's safeguard copy in Virtualize, which you can actually also get in Azure now. So you can have an array operating across Azure and your on-prem environment, which can store safeguarded copy snapshots anywhere you want. Well, you can actually protect the data protection storage every day. You could take one or two safeguard copies while you're shifting everything else out into long-term storage. It's not something we could have even offered last year. But you can, maybe it's not integrated into every product from day one, but you have the option to take those snapshots and they cannot be altered. It's like proper church and state separation. You can't take the snapshot and drop the snapshot. You're not relying on hardening some sort of Linux box and removing every conceivable daemon from it to the extent that actually it probably becomes more vulnerable because you can't manage them as easily.
I
And
like your philosophy there, Fraser, about you don't need to buy it all at once, right? Because you're going to want to think about, what are my attack vectors? What do I have in place? What do I need to complement that solution? You might have some stuff already, right?
yeah, and it might not be possible to upgrade your virtualize environment straight away, but it's an option. And you might not have the money as a company to do anything other than just stick a tape on a shelf. But as your company grows, or as it becomes more of a focus, or as the security team insists that you, as the data protection guy, is given a larger budget in order to protect, these things come into focus, and you can extend the products. And this is typically very limited in in products which are, generally speaking, appliance based.
So, kind of circling back to the foundational philosophical question, I guess. The sophistication of ransomware attacks is increasing all the time. There's now, marketplaces of ransomware available for subscription. Essentially, there's a whole sub economy built around ransomware.
Ransomware
there's also,
as a service.
Yeah, exactly. With the advent of cryptocurrency as a way to, collect ransom, which is far less traceable. This problem is going to continue to multiply and extend and expand and diversify into different areas. So while the we don't negotiate with terrorists metaphor is apt, I believe, the fact is, or the reality is, that these ransomware attacks for many organizations are an existential threat. So if I'm that company, if my mid-sized company with 100 employees is hit with a ransomware attack, and I have to decide, in 24 hours whether or not to pay up or essentially go out of business, philosophically, I want to say, no, I refuse to support this criminal activity. But on the other hand, more practically speaking, I may not have much of a choice. Now, if there's an upside to it, and this might be a reach, but if there's an upside to it, maybe that's going to encourage me to do some of the things we're talking about right now, right? So it's almost a pay me now, pay me later kind of a situation. I get subjected to an attack. I'm forced to pay, because if I don't, my company will no longer exist. But I'm now scared straight, in the sense that I'm going to go re-engineer my resilience environment and my data protection environment to ensure, or at least reduce the risk of this happening to me again. Is that kind of a weird silver lining in a sense? I don't know, maybe not.
I mean, definitely, yeah. And an example that I've drawn on a number of times is a hospital in the United Kingdom who had a data center next to the Buncefield oil depot. And it's not just them. The Police National Computers disaster recovery site was next to it as well. Did somebody not look over the fence and ask what these massive things with all the no smoking signs were? It was all nicely signed off. So anyway, the largest explosion in peacetime Europe happened, and absolutely destroyed these data centers. And you know what? Fast forward maybe 20 years, I guess. That hospital that was they went back to paper. It was everyone coming in on paper. That's a really serious problem for a modern hospital. They had not missed a beat when the WannaCry ransomware attack came along, because they had learned that, yeah, you might have your stuff off site, you might have tapes, but actually, if you're then taking the tapes back on site, you're cataloging them, you're using a managed services company to do it, you've not paid them as much money as you might have done, you're contending with other paying paying customers of the managed services environment, you've got to have got this right, you've got to have practiced. So yeah, when these horrible things happen, it does, it is a learning curve, but it's not a learning curve that you really want to have to go through.
So Steve, you mentioned insurance. I'm interested in your take on insurance, what you were going to share.
Okay, so that was going to be my next comment, Sean, right? So I've seen a recent report where over the course of, let's say, the last 3 years, so since 2018, right, the costs in insurance, cyber insurance premium have gone up 12%. right? And that's pretty significant when you think of, when they started out super low and now they're super high and very, very hard to get, right? So they're continuing to grow. And I've seen some recent reports about how some insurance companies are just going to stop, providing it because it's the premiums. I mean, not the premiums, but the costs are getting out of control of what you have to pay in order to get out of this situation. You guys hearing the same kind of thing?
I think the big reinsurers are trying to figure this out, and a lot of them, you're right, they're just pulling out. They won't underwrite those policies anymore because it's just too much exposure.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing when you go to the conferences, be they in person or in over the internet. Actually, more so in person, where you can ask them slightly more in-depth questions, and you can really gauge what they're saying. So you're advertising that you will deal with the ransoms, you will do the negotiation. How are you going to handle it if that the money is being paid to someone who has operates as a prescribed organization? A lot of terrorist groups, a lot of failed states are using ransomware because you get to sit down. You don't have to do the sort of old-fashioned crime where you have to walk around and kidnap people and demand ransoms from their Western oil
you get much better fuel mileage because you don't have to ever drive anywhere. You don't have to buy a lot of weapons from shady characters.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of an agreed way of operating within the oil industry, where you have some environments where you've got a fairly high chance of being kidnapped, but it was known, everyone knew what was happening, and it's all contained. And now you are potentially paying ransoms, certainly across state borders, international borders, and that becomes a whole lot more serious. If you're paying money to a terrorist organization based anywhere in the world, or specific named people who have sanctions against them, who aren't allowed to trade, banks take this very seriously. They mine their data coming in and out all of the time to see that if they can trace this activity. And ultimately, I picture myself standing up in front of a judge and saying, yeah, sorry, Your Honor, I had no idea that the person who tried to extort money from me could have possibly been a bad guy. It's that sort of thing. So we're seeing like you say, the reinsurers are pulling out. The insurers are getting a lot more tight about what they will insure, the kind of things you have to do to prove that you can get the insurance. There's lots of tick boxes to go through. And we're seeing a number of companies who have thought they had cyber insurance are finding out that it doesn't cover ransomware. It doesn't cover downloading something yourself and installing it and running it, because, it's like driving into the back of the car in front of you.
Yeah, it's a liability question.
Getting out of this one.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's this is also creating a lot of uncertainty around how state intelligence agencies or cyber crime units are tracking this. There have been some advances in the ability to trace cryptocurrency transactions and blockchain transactions. So, we saw the FBI, for example, was able to recover, $3 million of a $5 million ransom paid by the pipeline company. So the criminals will always be one step ahead, but at least there is now some sort of demonstrable progress being made in countermeasures. So that cat and mouse game, I'm sure, will continue, but the whole landscape of cyber threats and ransomware attacks is just going to continue to get more complicated and more far reaching. And it will also, I think, continue to move down market. It's not just always going to be targeted at the big guys. If anything, I think there's probably there's a desirable element of going after a smaller nondescript company because they're probably less concerned about the publicity to some degree. So that will make them, in theory, more willing to just, acquiesce to your demands and not make trouble. So it's going to get worse. As we always say, it's probably going to get worse.
I think that's already happened, right? With the attacks on hospitals, attacks on small government agencies. Here in the U.S., we have a very, very diversified decentralized structure for government, right? And I can't tell you how many of these, maybe a governmental entity that is in charge of government for 5,000 people is the one who's attacked, and all of a sudden the services for those 5,000 people aren't there anymore.
There's a bit of a flip side to that as well. If governmental organizations are being attacked and data is being exfiltrated, which is often the targets these days, get data out of personal data out of backup servers in particular, if you can just get a log on and it's one of those servers that describes their full backup as a single file, and you can copy that file, you've got that data. And they'll say, we've got your data, you can have it back. You don't know if they've duplicated it, copied it, and they have pulled out all of the PPI from it. And that in and of itself is an entirely different world of pain that you're going to be in, even if you do get back from the ransom. They're using exfiltrating data from these governmental or large companies to be able to then automate attacks against the individual, harvest more information, find out where they are working. And it's frighteningly sophisticated.
We've talked a lot about, nation states actually sponsoring a lot of these attacks. And then we see, at least here in the United States, I'd be curious from a European standpoint, the federal government come out saying, I don't know if we call them mandates or something, but saying, look, businesses really need to start following these best practices in order to make sure their environments are hardened against these threats, because they're still going to happen, right? But then you find these nation states are still doing this, right? Is Europe putting anything in place for its businesses or corporations saying they should follow something?
Yeah, we're seeing, certainly in the UK, we're seeing the National Cybercrime Unit, GCHQ possibly are operating courses to teach people and companies about how to do it. There was a law proposed, I think it might have actually gone into Parliament for discussion, about some of the entry points into your network. So your webcams, all those little things at the edge that allow data to come in that you don't necessarily know. Maybe your Amazon, and I won't say the name because it will go bing behind me because I forgot to put it on mute, but your personal assistants and things like that, they have to be updated. So it remains to be seen how that's going to play out, but you're not allowed to chuck something at customers that will make them vulnerable to attack, because these things build an ongoing information security problem.
So let's try to pull a lot of this stuff together, right? Sean, let's start with you, right? We've talked a lot over the course of the last number of weeks about, best ways to protect yourself against ransomware. And now we've seen a little bit more about how the attacks are happening. Any thoughts on, some things that you want to definitely validate as best practices that you're protecting your environment? Step one, I mean, we go around, we talk kind of step two, step three, that sort of thing.
There are a lot of things. I think most of the cost of this is process, right? So to me, when I start hearing things about these company guarantees, right? Like, you just pay me to buy your software and all your problems will be solved. I look at that and say, oh, geez, that's not true. I'm too old to believe that, right? So to me, a lot of the cost of this is in process and in business processes and doing the right thing. And I think you just have to proceed with the idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? I have to start looking at these things, looking at my business processes and doing the basics to help prevent them from happening and not get into this situation in the first place.
And also, never believe that in your personal life at home, you are not important enough for anyone to bother with you, because these attacks are automatable, they're scalable. Your personal information from, let's say, Facebook or something like that can be used, and was in the attack against Sony Pictures, was used to gain enough information to do spear phishing attacks against Sony. So, you might not think you're that important, but if you can be used to bounce a number of information gathering attacks off different people, and then you work all the way up to someone who maybe has a computer in reception, maybe has one in somewhere innocuous, maybe facilities management, something like that. You could be used to take the entire company down. This was something that came up on the Lazarus heist, which was an excellent podcast series on the BBC World Service. Details how a number of nation state attacks have happened in really great detail and the level they went to. And it's not done in a particularly dry sense. It's really engaging how they talk about it. It's well worth binge listening to. I think I went through all of them on about 3 days of running or something.
There you go. Randy, any thoughts? We've talked a lot about this over the last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll channel Trish and say test, test, test. So as we talk about designing and architecting environments for resilience and protection, the only way you're ever going to know that is if you have kind of a fire drill, right? So you've got to be able to frequently test to make sure that your vulnerability is limited as much as you can, that you have the ability to rapidly and consistently and repeatedly recover in the event that something inevitably does happen. And don't wait until it happens for real to discover that your recovery processes or your workflow are malfunctioning. That's the wrong time to find out. So do lots of testing.
This is Fraser's North rule of backup. So it's the 3 rules, and the North one you stick in on the top is it's not a backup until you've restored it.
No, that's what we always say. DR plan isn't a plan until you've tested that plan and make sure.
In the immortal words of Mike Tyson, he was being interviewed once, and whoever interviewed him said, people spend so much time developing a plan to fight you, and he said everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, and that's kind of what it boils down to.
Good one. Well, with that, I want to say thank you to everyone. Fraser, really, really appreciate it. Great topic, great conversation, and something that businesses need to be thinking about. And thanks for coming on the SpectrumCast again. I really appreciate it. Sean and Randy, thanks again. I appreciate it. And until next week, we're going to talk about client storage assessments and how they can help your business and in your storage practice, and we'll go from there. So thank you all very much.
Great.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Fraser.